Tom is a widower living in the suburbs with his two daughters, Jenny and Carrie. He works as a surgeon at the local hospital. A year after his wife's death, Tom begins secretly dating Sophie, a close friend of his late wife. At a community gathering, Jenny notices their relationship while texting her boyfriend, Chris. Chris, meanwhile, is having lunch with his family. His bitter father, Neil, starts an argument with everyone at the table, including Chris's French mother, Zoe. Elsewhere, Jojo and Lauren Marshall are heading out to celebrate their anniversary, leaving their daughter, Sia, in charge of the house. Despite promising not to throw a party, Sia does the opposite. Tom's best friend, Pete, notices Jenny acting strangely and mentions it to Tom. Tom dismisses it, assuming it's just teenage angst. During their conversation, Tom confides in Pete about the challenges of raising teenage daughters and reveals his concern about Jenny dating Chris, who is older than her. Tom also admits to hiring a tech expert to install spyware on Jenny's phone, which Pete strongly disapproves of. That night, Jenny and Chris attend Sia's party, where Sia is selling drugs to the guests. Chris quickly gets wasted, frustrating Jenny as they had plans after the party. Sophie's son, Henry, is also at the party. At home, Tom wakes up at 2 a.m. and realizes Jenny isn't home. He calls her, but she doesn't answer. Panicking, he checks the spyware on her phone. Nothing seems unusual until he sees a text that reads, "Tonight, heaven." Meanwhile, Sophie checks on Henry at home, who pretends to be asleep in his room. The next morning, Jenny is still missing. Tom, increasingly worried, tries calling her again, but she doesn't pick up. He wakes Carrie, and they head to Chris's house, hoping for answers. Zoe, Chris's mom, tells them Chris never came home and must be at his friend Ion's place. Carrie tracks down Ion's address, and they go there. Meanwhile, Sophie steps into her front yard and finds an old camper left behind by her ex-husband, Josh. At Ion's house, Tom questions him about Chris, but Ion admits he lied to Chris's parents and doesn't know where he is. He suggests Tom check with Sia. Tom confronts Sia at her house. She lied. She claimed she had just gone into town with a few friends the night before. Her parents believe her, but after Tom leaves, Sia grows nervous and heads to the pool in the backyard. Sophie, who is actually a police officer, heads to work where she meets her new colleague, Emma, recently relocated from the city. They investigate an anonymous note accusing Zoe of having an affair with a student. Searching Zoe's locker, they find a suspicious USB drive. When they open it, they discover explicit photos of Zoe alongside love letters that appear to be from a student. Zoe denies everything, claiming the evidence is fake, but she is taken in for further investigation. Meanwhile, Tom becomes too distracted at work and decides to report Jenny's disappearance to the police. He tries speaking to Ion again, but when Ion sees him, he runs off. After a tense chase, Ion nearly gets hit by a car and finally stops. In a nearby cafe, Ion admits there was a party at Sia's house and that Jenny was there. Tom returns to Sia's house and exposes her lies. Sia confesses that Jenny and Chris were at the party, but she doesn't know when they left, as she barely knows them. Tom informs Sia that he'll report everything to the police. Later, Pete is out jogging in the park when Emma, from afar, takes pictures of him. At her home, Emma pins the photos to a wall already covered with pictures of Pete, all taken in secret. Sophie returns home from work and finds Josh there, playing with their two daughters. Meanwhile, upstairs, Henry pulls out a blood-stained shirt from a bag and hurriedly stuffs it into the bottom of his closet. Soon after, Ion contacts Tom, saying he needs to talk. He shows Tom a video from Facebook where Jenny is seen getting into a car with Pete. Tom is too shocked to respond. Back at the Marshall's house, Sia's father, Jojo, goes into the garage and opens the freezer. Inside is Chris's body. A flashback reveals the events at the Marshall's house the night before. While Mr. and Mrs. Marshall were celebrating their anniversary at a hotel, Sia hosted a party at their home. Stepping outside to smoke, Sia was horrified to find Chris's body floating face down in the pool. Panicking, Sia tried calling her parents, but they didn't answer. Desperate, she pulled Chris's body from the water and realized he had likely overdosed on the drugs she sold him before drowning. Frantic, Sia quickly ended the party and kicked everyone out of the house. When her parents returned and learned what happened, Lauren wanted to call the police, but Jojo stopped her. Knowing Chris had drugs in his system, Jojo feared the scandal would ruin their family's reputation and business. He decided not to call the police and instead hid Chris's body in the freezer. Suspicious about Jenny's disappearance, Jojo and Lauren began to wonder if she had witnessed the overdose or was somehow involved. Either way, they needed to find her. In the present, Tom tries reaching Pete about Jenny, but Pete doesn't answer. Frustrated, Tom visits Pete's house, only to find him missing. Meanwhile, Emma and her team arrive at the Chahals' house with a search warrant for Zoe's case. Neil is furious, but the police find nothing suspicious. Tom later shows Sophie a video of Jenny getting into Pete's car. Sophie suspects Pete might have harmed Jenny, but Tom refuses to believe it, insisting Pete is a close friend. Sophie warns him that people aren't always what they seem. At the police station, Sophie asks a colleague to track Pete's car. They discover he's staying at a cheap hotel. Emma joins Sophie, pretending she knows nothing about Pete, despite having secret pictures of him at home. When they spot Pete's car and try to pull him over, he hesitates, raising their suspicion. Eventually, Pete stops, explaining he hadn't seen them earlier. Sophie tells him Jenny is missing, and Pete appears genuinely surprised. He says his phone was off, which is why he missed Tom's calls. In front of Sophie and Emma, Pete calls Tom and claims he knows nothing about Jenny's disappearance. He explains that Jenny called him for help, so he picked her up and dropped her off at home. Emma, suspicious, questions why Jenny would call Pete, implying something inappropriate. Pete denies it, revealing he's gay. Sophie keeps pressing, but Pete hints his interest is in Tom, not Jenny. He leaves to help Tom search for her, still unaware of Emma's hidden agenda. Back home, Tom finds a bank transfer receipt in Jenny's drawer for a payment to someone in China. He messages the person on Facebook using Carrie's iPad and discovers they sell fake IDs. Back at the police station, Emma grows frustrated with Sophie, accusing her of being too focused on Jenny's case because of her friendship with Tom. Sophie, in turn, suggests Zoe's case might be a prank by a student. Later, Pete and Sophie review the neighborhood's CCTV footage. It confirms Pete's story. He dropped Jenny off at 11:30 p.m., but instead of heading home, Jenny is seen walking toward Eric's house. Meanwhile, Emma questions Zoe with her lawyer present. Zoe denies that the naked photos found on the USB are hers, claiming they were photoshopped. However, the woman in the photos has a scorpion tattoo, just like Zoe, exposing her lie. Emma informs Zoe she's been bailed but is suspended from her job and prohibited from contacting anyone at the school. Tom and Pete visit Eric, who tells them Jenny was in his yard the night before, but ran into the Chahals' garden after he yelled at her. Meanwhile, Sophie and Darren visit the marshals to ask about Jenny. No one answers the door, but inside, the marshals are hiding in Sia's room. Sophie notices a moved plant near the pool and finds it suspicious, but Darren believes no one's home. Tom sneaks through Eric's yard and into the Chahals' garden, but finds nothing. Later, he and Pete ask Chris's father, Neil, about Jenny. Neil finds it odd that Jenny would come over after already being with Chris at the party, and instead complains about how difficult Chris and Zoe have been. They ask to look in Chris's room, where Pete finds a note with train times. Neil also mentions Chris's Vespa is missing. Zoe arrives home, but doesn't know where Chris is either. After leaving, Pete comments on how strange the family seemed. Upstairs, Zoe calls Chris, but only reaches his voicemail. She then makes another call, leaving a message about a problem and needing to meet. At the train station, Tom and Pete ask if anyone has seen Jenny, but come up empty-handed. However, Tom spots Chris's Vespa nearby. Just then, Carrie calls to say Chris posted a picture of himself and Jenny online, looking happy. Relieved, Tom thinks Jenny has run away with Chris. That night, the marshals try to move Chris's body to their factory. Lauren slips and breaks down, pleading with Jojo to call the police. Meanwhile, Tom talks to Sophie, convinced Jenny ran off with Chris due to the new photo. But Henry, Sophie's son, notices Jenny is wearing a different dress in the picture than at the party. His sister Ellen suggests checking Jenny's closet, where Tom finds the same dress, realizing the photo is old. He panics, remembering Jenny wore that dress the night his wife Rachel died. Jojo and Sia visit the police station, pretending a neighbor told them about Sophie and Darren's visit. While Jojo gives his statement, Sia is haunted by the previous night. They had revived Chris's wet phone by placing it in rice and used his defrosted thumb to unlock it and post the picture of him and Jenny. After Jojo and Sia leave, Darren calls the hotel where they stayed and learns they checked out early. Meanwhile, Pete tells Tom that Heaven is an 80s-themed bar in the city. Tom visits, but the manager claims they've never seen Jenny. Later, though, the manager is seen visiting Rachel's grave. The marshals argue about how to deal with Chris's body. While they wrap it up, a neighbor stops by and Sia knocks him out with a wine bottle to keep him from discovering the body. At the same time, Pete sneaks into someone's house while Emma searches for Pete's car registration at work. After Sia hits their neighbor, Martin, on the head, the marshals tie him up in the bathroom and debate what to do with him. But Jojo gets an urgent call from work, forcing him to leave. He tells his wife and daughter not to make any decisions while he's gone. Meanwhile, Sophie heads home to grab a shirt for her son, Henry, who has a hospital checkup since he needs a kidney transplant. While looking for the shirt, she stumbles upon a bloody one and becomes worried. At the hospital, Sophie confronts Henry, and he explains that he got into a fight and the blood isn't his. Sophie also visits Zoe, advising her to make a list of people she might have offended during her teaching career, suspecting that one of them could be framing Zoe for revenge. Back at the marshal's house, Sia gaslights Martin when he wakes up, accusing him of spying on her while she was showering. She threatens to accuse him of being a pedophile if he ever speaks up. She then releases him. Meanwhile, Tom is trying to get in touch with Pete about his missing daughter, Jenny. When they meet, Tom receives a mysterious call demanding £5,000 in exchange for information about Jenny's whereabouts. The caller knows specific details, like what Jenny was wearing the night she disappeared, convincing Tom that this is serious. Pete comes up with a plan and reminds Tom to stick to it. Later, Tom drops off the money at a train station, pretending to walk away while secretly recording with his phone. Pete watches from a distance. A man, who Tom recognizes as a bouncer from the Heaven Club, picks up the money. Pete follows him, but when the bouncer realizes he's being tailed, he attacks Pete. Tom arrives just in time and overpowers the man. The bouncer admits he doesn't know much, only that Jenny had been looking for the club's manager, Bobby, and he was just trying to make some quick cash. Just as Tom thinks things can't get worse, he gets another call, this time from Carrie's school, where a teacher reports that Carrie has gone missing. Tom rushes to the school and speaks with Ellen, who believes Carrie might have gone to the community center where Tom's late wife Rachel used to work. At the center, Tom snaps at one of Rachel's old colleagues after seeing pictures of her with strangers. The colleague mentions that Rachel often took the girls to the city art gallery. Tom heads to the gallery and finds Carrie sitting in a spot she used to visit with her mom. They have a heartfelt conversation, and Carrie promises to help him find Jenny. At the hospital, Zoe gives Sophie a list of people who might hold grudges against her. The marshals are on the list, so Sophie and Emma decide to visit them. Meanwhile, Jojo and Sia are trying to move Chris's body again when Emma and Sophie arrive, almost catching them in the act. The marshals explain they were upset with Zoe for not giving Sia a role in the school drama club. Jojo talks nonstop to distract the police from the body hidden behind them. At the same time, Chris's sister is furious with Neil for not showing more concern about Chris's disappearance. Tom and Carrie, now working together, look up Bobby online and find out his real name is Archie Robert. Surprisingly, he was Rachel's high school sweetheart, the same high school where Zoe teaches. That night, Tom confronts Bobby at his flat. Bobby admits he recognizes Jenny because she looks just like Rachel when she was young. He confesses to being jealous of Tom for marrying Rachel and having a family with her. Bobby also mentions that Jenny left a note saying, "I know about Jasmine. I'll be back tomorrow night," but claims he doesn't know who Jasmine is. Jenny never returned the following night. Tom and Pete search Rachel's car and find parking tickets from a place called Jasmine Hall. They head there and are shocked to discover it's a psychiatric institution. Meanwhile, Jojo and Sia row a boat out to the middle of a lake to dump Chris's body. But as they drive away, Chris's body floats back to the surface. Later, Emma discovers that the boy in the photo from the USB found in Zoe's locker is from an art exhibition 20 years ago in Brazil. She immediately informs Sophie about this new lead. The next day, Chris's body floats to the surface and drifts to shore. A fisherman nearby discovers it and calls the police. The authorities arrive quickly, and Sophie confirms it's Chris. She and Emma go to the Chahal's house to break the news. When Zoe opens the door and sees the police, she immediately knows and breaks down in tears. Meanwhile, Tom continues investigating at Jasmine Hall. While the receptionist steps away, he sneaks a look at the guest ledger but gets caught and kicked out before finding anything useful. Rushing home, Tom checks to see if Jenny has returned, but she's still missing. Sophie also arrives, and they exchange updates. Chris's body has been found, and Tom shares what he discovered about Bobby and Jasmine Hall. Sophie needs Jenny's DNA to search the lake area, just in case. Pete calls Tom, reminding him about one of their critical patients, and despite everything going on, Tom rushes to attend to it. Sophie asks Emma to analyze Chris's body, but Emma suddenly becomes emotional. She opens up about why she transferred to the suburbs. One of her colleagues had been killed in a hit and run. Meanwhile, the marshals feel relieved after dumping Chris's body. Jojo encourages his wife to act cheerful and keep up their usual appearance. Tom later visits the hospital and spots a man on crutches, who he had seen talking to Jenny. The man, now with his cast off, denies knowing anything and dashes off before Tom can chase him. However, with Pete's help, Tom gets his details from a colleague. The man's name is Scott. Emma soon finds traces of chlorine in Chris's lungs, meaning he drowned in a pool, not the lake. She informs Sophie, and the police immediately head to the marshal's house, where they are having a barbecue as part of Jojo's plan to act normal. Jojo orders his wife and daughter to stay silent, no matter what the police ask. But Martin is already there, ready to spill everything. He reveals he saw them wrapping the dead body, how they hit him on the head and tied him up in the bathroom. Tom and Pete tail Scott, who goes to the community center where Rachel used to work. When they arrive, Scott has already left, but Tom is shocked to learn that Scott knew Rachel and had come to pick up a memento from the office clearance. As Tom looks through Rachel's belongings, he finds a diary filled with entries about Jasmine Hall. Back at the police station, Sophie interrogates Jojo in the presence of his lawyer, but Jojo remains completely silent. Darren texts Sophie asking her to come urgently. He shows her CCTV footage from the train station, revealing Jenny was confronted by Josh. Meanwhile, Emma finds another CCTV clip showing Jenny returning to the area after the night of the party, prompting the police to start a door-to-door search in the gated community to find witnesses. Sophie and Darren secretly go to confront Josh without telling other officers. Inside Josh's camper, they find women's clothes and makeup. Josh explains they belong to a young woman he's helping, letting her sleep in his camper while he sleeps in his van. He admits he ran into Jenny at the train station, budged him not to tell anyone, and that's all he knows. Pete decides to follow Scott, but ends up being chased by a group of thugs. They corner and stab him, leaving him for dead. Tom panics when Pete's phone cuts out, unsure of where he is. Tracking down the thugs, Tom fights them off. Grabbing Scott by the collar, he demands to know Pete's location, revealing he's Rachel's husband. Scott finally gives in. Tom and Scott find Pete bleeding badly, but they manage to call an ambulance and give him first aid. Sophie and Emma visit Helen, one of the neighbors, and ask if she has seen Jenny. Helen denies it. However, after the police leave, Helen goes inside and talks to Jenny, who is hiding and crying, devastated by the news of Chris's death. The flashback shows Jenny leaving her house on her way to Sia's party, when Helen suddenly stops her, asking, "Where's the tape?" Jenny denies knowing what she means and hops into her friend's car. In the present, Pete is rushed to the hospital in critical condition. After surgery, he is no longer in immediate danger, but remains unconscious. The Chahals are devastated by Chris's death. A neighbor brings food, but Neil, Zoe, and their daughter Tilly are painfully aware of Chris's empty seat at the table. Sophie confronts Tom about investigating Jenny's case on his own, warning him it's too dangerous and urging him to leave it to the police. Meanwhile, Emma visits Pete's hospital room and holds his hand just as Tom and Sophie barge in. Tom grows suspicious, feeling like he's seen Emma before, but can't place her. He later looks her up online and discovers she's the daughter of Karina Castle, an old medical school classmate of his and Pete's. Tom confronts Emma and she reveals her mother died of cancer 4 years ago. She also confesses that Pete is her biological father and she came to town to see him. But because Pete became a suspect in Jenny's disappearance the day she arrived, she hesitated to approach him. Now she regrets not reconnecting with him sooner. Tom comforts her, promising to keep her secret and assures her Pete will recover. Scott visits the hospital to return Pete's belongings, which he managed to recover from the thugs. Tom presses Scott for details about the gang, but Scott claims not to know them. Seizing the moment, Tom asks Scott about his conversation with Jenny at Sia's party. Scott says Jenny was troubled by a secret Rachel had told her before she died, and Jenny had emphasized that her father couldn't know about it. Tom regrets not returning home earlier the day Rachel died. He had been out with Sophie, and they kissed, unaware that Jenny had called him multiple times. By the time he rushed home, Rachel had already passed, and Jenny was furious with him. In the present, Carrie tells Tom that Helen visited Rachel the night she died, but she doesn't know what they discussed. Tom checks Jenny's iPad and finds a folder of Rachel's high school photos with names written by Jenny. One of the names is Helen, Tom's next-door neighbor. The next morning, Tom sees Helen leaving her house early and returning later. He knocks on her door, but no one answers, heightening his suspicion. At the police station, Jojo hears from a fellow inmate that convicts involved in crimes against children are treated brutally in prison. Horrified, Jojo writes a statement confessing that he alone was responsible for Chris's accidental death, claiming he was drunk and that Chris fell into the pool after an altercation. After his confession, Lauren and Sia are released. The town holds a vigil for Chris. There, Tom questions Henry after seeing him at Sia's party. He presses Henry about his bloody sweater, but Henry denies involvement until his mom steps in. Henry reveals that Chris had fought with a boy named Mike, and Henry broke up the fight. He was reluctant to tell anyone because he didn't want to be labeled a snitch. Darren informs them that Chris's time of death was between 10:30 and 11 p.m., while Jojo and Lauren left their hotel at 11:16, clearing them of suspicion. During another interrogation, Jojo learns that Chris wasn't drugged but was forcibly strangled and drowned. Realizing Sia couldn't have done that, Jojo tells the truth. At home, Tom sees that all his texts to Jenny have turned blue, meaning she's read them. Filled with hope, he texts her again, and this time Jenny replies, but she vanishes again after he asks where she is. Tom contacts Ben, a tech expert, to track Jenny's IP address. Ben quickly discovers that Jenny is using Tom's own IP address. Initially, Tom thinks Jenny is hiding in the house, but she's nowhere to be found. Ben suggests she could be nearby, so Tom searches the garden, but finds nothing. Then he realizes there's one more possible location, Helen's house. When Tom goes there, the door is open, and to his shock, the house is on fire. As he searches inside, he finds someone lying on the floor. Outside, Eric is watching the house burn. The reason Chris fought with Mike was that Mike had called Zoe, Chris's mom, a MILF, and meant it literally. Nearby, Neil sat crying in his car. In the present, Tom discovers the person on the floor is Helen, and she's dead. He calls the firefighters, then leaves the house, following Ben's instructions on the phone to find Jenny. Eric tries to stop him as the police arrive and chase after Tom, but he doesn't stop. Sophie and Emma are at the Chahals to inform them about the marshal's involvement in hiding Chris's body. They also learn that Mike insulted Zoe, and Chris fought him at Sia's party. Sophie suggests Mike could be the one who planted the USB in Zoe's locker. At that moment, Sophie is notified about the fire at Helen's house, and everyone rushes there except Tilly. When everyone leaves, someone breaks into the Chahal house. Tilly hides in the closet but accidentally hurts herself. Tom, still following Ben's directions, arrives at the Chahal's house, which has already been raided. Tilly, mistaking Tom for the intruder, confronts him with a knife. Tom explains he's Jenny's dad, and she drops the knife. Meanwhile, Tom is now a suspect in the fire at Helen's house. Ben informs him that Jenny's phone tracker is disabled. Tilly calls her parents, and they return home. Neil suspects Jenny might be involved in Chris's murder, while Tom notices the place that was raided the most was his study, and wonders what the intruder was after. Zoe suddenly has a panic attack, and Neil confesses he planted the USB in her locker. He explains that during a rough patch in their marriage, he wanted to teach her a lesson. The police find Jenny's phone discarded in front of the Chahal's house, and Sophie brings it to Tom. The next day, Darren gets a call from forensics. He informs the team that Helen died before the fire due to a skull fracture, and accelerant was found at the scene, meaning someone intentionally started the fire. They also found Jenny's wallet in the house. Tom goes to the hospital to pick up Pete, who is now awake and ready for discharge. Tom sees another man leaving Pete's room before entering. Pete reveals he has been in a secret relationship with the man for 6 months, explaining why he sometimes sneaked in by the fence near Tom's house. The man is married with kids, and they've kept it hidden. Emma tries to talk to Pete but feels discouraged. On the way home, Pete theorizes that Jenny might have killed Chris, which is why she's in hiding. Tom gets angry and decides to shift suspicion to Neil, thinking he's more suspicious. Meanwhile, Mike shows up at the police station wanting to confess. He fears he might have hit Chris too hard during their fight. He's relieved when the police tell him Chris died from drowning, not the fight. Emma goes to Eric's house to get his statement about Helen's death. He mentions a fire at the high school years ago where children died, but no one was convicted. Later, Tom and Pete pass by Chris's memorial and find Neil there. Tom confronts him about Jenny, but suddenly Zoe appears and says she wants to confess something. However, Neil already knows Zoe has been cheating on him with Ian. Meanwhile, Jenny is with Bobby in a dark, unknown place. Pete drives home from Tom's place and notices Emma following him. He stops to confront her, telling her to leave him alone. After a moment of silence, Emma reveals the truth. Pete is her father, and her mother, who died 4 years ago, kept his identity hidden. It wasn't until her aunt told her the truth that Emma learned who he was. She explains that she's pregnant and the father, her boyfriend and colleague, was killed in the hit and run she mentioned to Sophie. Needing family more than ever, Pete embraces her, and they find comfort in finally connecting. Meanwhile, Tom persuades the security guard to show him the gate's CCTV footage by threatening to expose the guard's drinking problem. The footage reveals Bobby entering the neighborhood. Before acting on this information, Tom confronts Ion about his affair with Zoe, suspecting a connection to Chris's death. Ion denies any involvement, but mentions seeing Jenny and Henry leaving the bathroom together at the party. Tom tries to question Henry again, but Sophie stops him, still upset after he humiliated Henry at Chris's vigil. Seeking help from Emma, they bring Henry to the police station for questioning, much to Sophie's frustration. Josh handles the interrogation while Sophie watches from outside. Henry reveals that Jenny suspected her father, Tom, was spying on her through her phone, and Henry had helped her investigate it. He also shares that Jenny resented Tom and Sophie for being together the night her mother died. Suddenly, Henry has a seizure and is rushed to the hospital. At the same time, Tom and Pete head to Heaven to find Bobby. Although the staff insists Bobby isn't there, Tom sneaks into his office while Pete creates a distraction. Bobby watches the break-in via CCTV from a hidden location. After finding some paperwork, Tom is caught by the staff, who warn him that Bobby is dangerous. As Tom and Pete are about to leave, they spot Eric entering the bar. Eric flees when he sees them, but Pete manages to slip a phone into his pocket to track him. They initially follow Eric home, but later track him to Jasmine Hall. At the station, Emma questions Jojo again, suspecting there's more to Chris's death. Jojo mentions finding Sia's necklace in the pool filter while cleaning after moving Chris's body. However, when Emma takes Sia to retrieve the necklace, Sia claims she's never seen it before. Back at Jasmine Hall, Tom and Pete cause a disturbance again, and Tom is nearly tasered by security. Eric steps in, telling Tom it's time he knew the truth. Eric takes Tom to a room in the clinic and introduces him to his son, Craig, who is mute and has severe burn scars from a fire. Eric explains that Craig survived the school fire years ago that killed 8 children, but his life has been miserable since. Rachel used to visit Craig regularly because they were friends. Eric reveals a shocking truth. Although the fire was ruled an accident, it was started by students seeking revenge on a teacher. The culprits were Craig, Helen, Bobby, Rachel, and Sophie. Stunned, Tom heads to confront Sophie. Sophie confesses to Tom that everything Eric said was true. Craig was burned when he ran back into the burning school to rescue the trapped students he saw on CCTV, and the trauma left him mute. Tom tells Sophie that Rachel likely hinted something to Jenny about the fire before she died, and Jenny uncovered the rest on her own. He also believes Bobby killed Helen and now has Jenny. Sophie promises to help save Jenny. She calls Bobby, pretending to want to cover up the fire, and Bobby admits Jenny is at his apartment. Sophie offers to help him get rid of her and agrees to meet. In a flashback, Jenny visits Helen to ask about her mother and finds an old VHS tape hidden in a memory box. The tape shows 6 teenagers entering the school before the fire, but it cuts off. After researching, Jenny and Chris discover an article about the school fire and realize the truth. Chris wants to confront Sophie, but Jenny, knowing she's with Tom, insists they confront Bobby instead. That night, Jenny loses Chris at Sia's party and decides to go to Heaven alone, taking Chris's motorbike to the train station. At Heaven, the bar staff warn Jenny to stay away from Bobby. She leaves a note for him and heads to Helen's, where she confronts Helen about the fire. Helen admits what happened, and Jenny, fearing her dad is tracking her phone, tells Helen she doesn't want Tom involved. Meanwhile, as Emma and Sophie search for Jenny at Helen's house, Jenny overhears them discussing Chris's death and is devastated. Helen, convinced Bobby killed Chris, calls him to confront him. Bobby arrives at Helen's, and when she threatens to expose the truth, he kills her, sets the house on fire, and kidnaps Jenny to keep his secret safe. In the present, Sophie and Tom drive to Bobby's flat. Sophie enters, leaving the fire escape open for Tom to sneak in. She calls Tom so he can listen in. Inside, Bobby points a gun at Sophie, but she convinces him she's on his side and he lowers the weapon. Bobby admits to killing Helen and insists they need to kill Jenny too. Sophie pretends to agree, distracting Bobby while Tom sneaks in. Tom attacks Bobby, but Bobby overpowers both Tom and Sophie, holding them and Jenny at gunpoint. Realizing he can't escape, Bobby shoots himself. Everyone is left in shock. When the police arrive, Tom and Jenny urge Sophie not to confess about the fire, and Jenny promises to keep her name out of it during questioning. Emma questions Jenny, but is puzzled. How did Bobby know Chris was at Sia's party? When the police show Jenny a pendant found in the pool filter, she says she's never seen it before. Tom recognizes it as Sophie's and realizes she must have killed Chris. Tom confronts Sophie at her house. She admits to killing Chris, but insists it was an accident. In a flashback to the party, Sophie had gone to Sia's to pick up Henry. In the backyard, Chris confronted her about the fire. Though Sophie denied it, Chris mentioned the tape and said he would report her to the police. He secretly recorded their conversation. They struggled over the phone, fell into the pool, and in the fight, Sophie held Chris underwater until he drowned, her necklace coming off in the struggle. Back in the present, Tom, heartbroken, tells Sophie he loves her but can't live with the lies. He calls the police and turns her in for Chris Chahal's murder. As Sophie is arrested, flashbacks reveal all the moments she thought she had gotten away with it.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe and like for more videos like this.